guys, so today we're going to be looking at frame rates, what they mean and when to use them. So let's get into it. Alright guys, Neil from Neil Collins Recording. If you're new, welcome. If you're a subscriber, welcome back. Great to have you on board as always. If you like the video, please give me a like, subscribe and hit the bell. Trying to build a bit of a community here, so it all helps, believe me. So this video was actually going to be a drone video. I was going to go through some cinematic drone shots, but the weather's just been crap. And I wanted to put together a nice video to go with the footage, and I'm going to wait till there's some sun. So I put that on hold for now, but I've been seeing the same question on a lot of forums, which frame rate should I be shooting at? And I just think it's good to get a general understanding of how frame rates work, and then you can work out which frame rates you should be shooting at. You can plan your shoots better, and in general just improve your filmmaking and editing. So I'm just going to go through the basics. I'm not going to go too in depth. I'm going to show a few examples, and hopefully this will help you out when you're shooting and editing. Now it's important to understand frame rates, what they do and when to use them. That way you can get the best out of your footage. Ideally you need to know which frame rate you're going to be editing at, so that you know which frame rate to shoot at. There's a difference between the frame rate that you shoot at and the frame rate on your timeline. I'll go into that a little bit more in a sec. So what are frame rates? Well, basically, when you shoot video, it's not really a continuous video. It's a series of images, and the images are sped up to look like they're moving. That's how video works. The higher the frame rate, the more images you're taking in the same amount of time. If you're shooting at 24 frames per second, you're taking 24 pictures in that second. And all these pictures go together to make the moving image. So over time, and with the advent of cinema, 24 frames per second became the standard for cinematic film. It's got the right amount of motion blur that makes it appealing to the eye. Now some film is also shot in 25 frames per second, depending on which part of the world you're from. It's either 24 or 25 frames per second. Different parts of the world have different video standards. It's all to do with the different colour encoding systems. Anything in blue is PAL, and anything in green is NTSC. So you can see the Americas use NTSC, and pretty much everywhere else uses PAL. So because of this, you'll find that most cameras shoot in either 24 or 25 frames per second. I wouldn't get too hung up on this. For the purpose of this video, I'm going to be using a 24 frame per second timeline in my editing software. I just wanted to mention it in case some of you are thinking, well, how comes my camera shoots at 25 frames per second? That's why. You put 25 frames per second on a 24 frames per second timeline, it's going to be fine. It's not going to make any difference at all. So there's a difference between the frame rates that you shoot in and the frame rates on your timeline. You can shoot in 60 frames per second in the camera, and you can still use a 24 frames per second timeline. And if you drag a 60 frames per second clip onto a 24 frames per second timeline, it will just become a 24 frames per second clip on the timeline. So this first clip was shot in 24 frames per second, and now I've moved it onto a 24 frames per second timeline. So it's just going to be 24 frames per second. It's going to play at 24 frames per second, which will give it that cinematic look. It'll have a bit of motion blur and it'll look cinematic. So I'll just play the clip and you'll see what I mean. And there we go. Bit of motion blur. You know, it just looks cinematic. I mean, it went out of focus a little bit. That's just bad filming. But so what would happen if I shot the same sequence in 60 frames per second and then set up a 60 frames per second timeline? Then you've got a 60 frames per second sequence and you're putting it onto a 60 frames per second timeline, so the timeline itself can handle more images per second. You've got more data in the initial capture, and you've got a timeline that can fit more images on the timeline. So you just get a sharper image. It looks more real, which is why it looks a bit uncomfortable, because it looks like a bit too, kind of looks HD. Anyway, I'll play the clip and you can see what I mean. And you can see there's hardly any blur or anything. It just looks like you're there. It just feels like you're there with them. It looks quite amateur, because a lot of phones just shoot in real time, and that's what it looks like. You could use a 60 frames per second timeline, but I don't know why you would want to. If you were shooting something like sports or something fast moving, you might want to use a 30 frames per second timeline, because then you're capturing more images in that second, and your timeline will allow for those extra images. So you'll have a little less motion blur. So if it's quick moving, that's sometimes what you want. So you might consider a 30 frames per second timeline. Very rare, I would think, you would want to use a 60 frames per second timeline. So what would happen if you filmed in 60 frames per second? If you took your 60 frames per second footage and slowed it down to 24 frames per second, so you stretch the images out over a longer period of time, and that's how you get real slow-mo. And that's the right way to do it. If it was shot in 24 frames per second and you tried to slow it down, you wouldn't have enough frames, so it's going to get jittery. That's why you need to plan ahead, because if you know that you're going to want to slow it down in post, then you're going to want to shoot in 60 frames per second or 120 frames per second if you want super slow-mo. If you slowed the 60 frames per second clip down to 24 frames per second and then put it on a 24 frames per second timeline, you will then get true slow-mo, like here. So just as an example, I'm going to take this 24 frames per second footage on a 24 frames per second timeline, and I'm going to make the footage with a little plugin I've got. I'm going to make the footage 12 frames per second, and then you'll see what happens. Okay, so this is what would happen. So this is at 12 frames per second on a 24 frames per second timeline. See, there's not enough data to keep the image flowing, so it starts stuttering because it's missing images. Just to go totally over the top, I mean, this would never happen, but this would be what happened if you took an image that was 1 frame per second and put it on a 24 frames per second timeline. It would look like this. They're just images, just photos really, you can see. So there you can see it, they're just photos, they're just images sped up or slowed down. As long as you understand frame rates a little bit, you can go into a shoot knowing that if you want to slow something down, you shoot that in 60 frames per second. If you've got something with audio, you just want to shoot that in 24 frames per second because you want the audio to sync up with the video. So you just shoot that in 24 frames per second. If you're going to use a 24 frames per second timeline, you shoot that in 24 frames per second, and then the audio will match up perfectly with the video. So yeah, if you're shooting B-roll, everyone's done a coffee B-roll at one point. I think I've done 2 now. Going into shooting that B-roll, I knew that I was going to slow some of it down. So I just shot the whole thing in 60 frames per second because there was no audio involved. I knew if I just wanted it to play at normal speed, I could just put it onto 24 frames per second timeline as it was, and it would just play at normal speed, or I could slow it down to 24 frames per second and that would give me real slow-mo. So we're going to leave it there for today. I hope you've enjoyed the video. If you have, like, subscribe, hit the bell, leave a comment as well. It's always good to get comments from you guys, so leave a comment below, let me know what you think, or if you have any questions or anything to share with the group. Anyone's welcome, so yeah, leave a comment below. I'll catch you next time.